a lot going on in the Thelemic community. But one of the things that I keep looking at is the leadership. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on the leaders, and not necessarily how any individual leader is performing per se, although that is important, but how these people got into the leadership positions in the first place. People spend a lot of time criticizing Hymenaeus Beta or Sabazius. I mean, I'm certainly guilty of that. But a lot of people are not looking at how these people got their positions in the first place, or even their predecessors, or how leadership develops in the Thelemic community or the occult community in general. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think there's a number of competing climactic sort of conditions that create leadership, and I think as the Thelemic community has changed, it tends to self-select leaders and look at leaders in different ways. That's probably natural, but it also becomes problematic. And if you look back, there's a sort of architectural arrangement in which the people who were first attracted to Crowley tended to be well, I would say the people attracted to the Grady-era OTO tended to be people from the hippie milieu, very bohemian, sort of in rebellion against normative middle-class values. And although there were some exceptions to that, in general, those were the people who formed the leadership cadre around Grady. And because of this, the Grady-era people are often mocked, and their involvement at that point is often used to excuse problems and difficulties that the OTO is still having. I mean, I've seen emails from leaders, and I've talked to leaders who still blame their current problems on the Grady-era people. So you've got this sort of hippie, countercultural, very wild and woolly milieu with a lot of the associated behaviors that, you know, that we think of when we think of that group, transiting after a while as that group goes through burnout and frustration and difficulties, sometimes due to their lifestyle, sometimes due to other factors, transitioning into a more middle-class environment where people are seen as potential leaders because they meet middle-class criteria. They have a home that they own, that they have stable jobs, that their family lives aren't constantly collapsing, and they look like trustworthy, solid individuals. So my feeling is that the new leadership in the occult community tends to look more stable. And I'll confess, you know, when this leadership first began to make its move towards, you know, taking control of the organization, I thought it was great. I totally thought this was the future of the organization, that these people were going to kind of clean up the mess and the craziness that the hippies had created, and really work towards, you know, making the group stable and making it look more serious. And it looked that way for a while, and then, you know, I think we've seen that the problem is that good, solid, stable middle-class agents are good, solid, stable middle-class agents because they have good, solid, stable middle-class agent values. And those values are not ones that predispose you towards experimenting with magic, learning a lot about Gnosticism on a practical level, and really embracing the more transgressive elements in Crowley's teaching. So a crisis began to develop where, while the middle-class leaders were in power, they had qualms and conflicts about the group and the teachings that they were in charge of. And that conflict, I think, is the fundamental one that you see in the order right now on the leadership level, and I think it sort of stalled the progress of the OTO. They're caught, as a friend of mine puts it, you know, part of the way up a mountain. I won't say halfway because I don't think they're halfway there yet, but part of the way up. They can't go any further up because that conflicts against their values, and they don't really want to go back down and admit the whole thing was a mistake and that they're not really into it anymore anyway. So they're sort of trapped there on the side of the mountain. They have a kind of shaky camp set up, if you'll enable me to continue the analogy, and they don't really know what to do. And I think that's sort of the frustration of a lot of people, is that they're saying, hey, come on, you know, you're the OTO, you're this group that, you know, says it's all about these things. You know, why aren't you moving forward? Where's the progress? Where's the plans? Where's the goals? Let's see the results. And they're, you know, sitting there going like, we don't really want to go either way.
Mm-hmm. Well, to kind of look at something in the middle class thing, though, and I don't want to get too far off this issue, but I think there's an important point there. You know, people hearing that are going to then turn around and look at things that you and I say about having strategic goals, about getting property, about having transparency in management and processes, about accountability for the leadership, they're going to look at those things and say, well, that's all very middle class, and that's something that you and I advocate. So they're going to say that we're kind of being hypocritical about that, and that we're criticizing the middle class, but yet all these middle class things that have made the middle class stable are things that we're appealing to.
Well, yeah, but again, and I don't discount that criticism, and I think it bears a great deal of thought and investigation, but the problem is that I don't think that it's wrong to want to harness middle-class values and middle-class skills to projects that may be inimical to the values that middle class aspires to. I mean, Lenin once said, the bourgeoisie will sell you the robe today you will use to hang them with tomorrow. And I don't think it's wrong for anybody to take the skills that they've learned in life and apply them to helping move the great work forward. So the idea that somehow because you've learned accountability or transparency or strategic planning, in a middle-class environment means that you can't apply that in the OTO seems absurd. The difficulty is that what we've seen is the middle-class leaders suffer a sort of bizarre schizophrenic breakdown at a certain point where all of the skills that they used to become good middle-class agents, they refuse to use in the OTO. I mean, this is one of the chief conflicts between, I think, yourself and the middle-class leaders that once supported you as a fellow leader, in that you expected them to behave like middle-class agents when it came to the OTO, and rather than doing that, they started to make exceptions and say, well, you might expect this sorts of plans and processes and procedures and, uniform enforcement of policy and everything else in another kind of environment, but you can't expect it here. And so one of the ways of coping with their conflict is to turn the OTO into sort of a break from middle-class life, where it becomes a sort of respite from the sort of demands and accountability issues that they face in other circumstances. So when we say, why don't you apply the same sort of principles and ideas that you have in the rest of your life to the OTO, they say, well, that's not what the OTO is about. It's a place where we go to avoid those kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. And that's another source of the conflict. But ultimately, do you transcend your class problems by blowing them off or by moving through them? And if there is a better way of building the Blue Equinox model for the OTO that doesn't involve any of the things that we've talked about or discussed or suggested, then I'd like to see what it is. I mean, I could be hideously wrong. If strategic planning is something that's like completely deleterious, if transparency is a bad idea, if demanding more money from the members in terms of mandatory local dues, if hiking up the standards are these all awful ideas, and there's some like higher, more aristocratic method of constructing the OTO the way Crowley designed it and the way that the leaders themselves say they want it to look, then I'd be happy to look at that and even embrace it. But no one's offering that. Instead, they're just retreating from the model and saying, well, maybe down the line, many years hence, we'll actually own property.
So, yeah,
is that a middle class? I mean, is that a middle class response? The middle class got to be the middle class because they were homeowners and owned property.
Right.
Why doesn't the OTO take a more vigorous attitude about owning property? Well, if it did, it would have to be more rigorous and more responsible and accountable about every other part of itself. Someone once said, I think I've said this before on the podcast, but it bears repeating, ambition that does not reckon with sacrifice results in neurosis. Mm-hmm. Well, they're saying they're ambitious about the Blue Equinox. Who's talking about the sacrifice? At no point have the leaders come to us and said, this is our ambition, here's the sacrifice we're expecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very strange reflection of the Bush administration. I mean, here we are in war, and and the sacrifices that George W. Bush asks of the United States is to continue shopping.
Right, they're giving tax cuts while the war is going on. Very weird, especially from the Republicans who used to be known as the balanced budget party, who were totally opposed to the idea of spending more than you brought in. The balanced budget amendment was a plank on the Republican Party platform, and Bush is blowing the deficit through the roof. But again, I think if people take the time to really study the reasons why Bush doesn't want to ask Americans to make sacrifices, they're going to see similar reasons as to why the OTO administration doesn't want to ask its members for money to publish the Crowley books or for more money in local dues. The same trepidation is there. If the Bush administration asked everybody to pony up immediately what the cost of the war was and didn't put it on the national credit card, so to speak, everyone would be opposed to the war and people, would freak out and they know they wouldn't get anywhere. Well, if the OTO leaders said, hey, look, we're going to really build the Blue Equinox and buy property and take this really seriously and everyone has to pony up, then most of the members would quit. They just won't pay. And I'm not talking about the low-level members. A lot of them would probably stay. I'm talking about the upper degrees and the friends and buddies of the leaders. But getting back to the class issue there, you're looking at like how people become leaders in the OTO. If you show up in an OTO body and you own your own home and you have a stable job and you look like a good middle-class agent, they will try to promote you into leadership.
Yes.
I've been amazed at the way some of my friends who fit this description have been offered leadership positions in the OTO when people barely know who they are. They
or that they're like first degrees.
Yeah. They're like, we're going to put you in charge of the lodge. They're that desperate for middle-class agents. And in a way, it's understandable because the OTO, it doesn't want to screen out free riders and moochers. It has a real, antipathy towards a sect-like environment. It wants a church environment. It needs people who have these resources and seem stable because they're surrounded often by people who don't have any resources and are very unstable. So you need to have these middle-class agents running the organization. And as we've seen, though, when you try to challenge middle-class values or when you take middle-class values too far and expect that the OTO will actually start buying property and taking itself seriously the way any other serious middle-class institution is run, there's objections and problems and screaming and yelling and, all sorts of things. So.
Now, but let's go back before Grady. I think, you can trace a lot of present dysfunction mirrored in past dysfunction. I mean, everything from the lack of planning in Germer's time, and some also from the lack of planning in Crowley's time, and by Crowley and the followers of Crowley. So it seems to me that there's a long pattern of a lack of planning, of dysfunction, of people not taking this seriously. And it seems to me that people are really going to have to look at these things and take them to heart and really come up with some different solutions. And one of the things that really bothers me is the way that people are moving away from actually looking at any kind of causes and conditions and determinants that are in the past for what is around today, and are just looking for, fingers to point, like what you're saying. The current leaders point, just back to Grady's time.
Well, a lot of them want to blame Crowley too. I mean, a lot of people, basically blame Crowley the way they blame their parents for their problems. He didn't plan well enough. He didn't. And you know what?
There may be
cross every
that,
T and dot every I.
But I mean, we're talking about 100 years here. I mean, there's a lot that has happened in 100 years. Crowley's been dead now 60 years. Mm-hmm. So, when are people going to start looking at, even after 47, Crowley's dead, boom, done. So what are people going to learn from the last 60 years? What kind of diagnosis are they going to do? See, at a previous job I had, we would do a project, and the project could be anywhere between a 6-month project or a 2-year project, from a budget of, a few $100,000 to a few million. But at the end of every project, we would do a post-mortem. We would look back. We would say, okay, what worked? What didn't work? How did these processes go? What can we improve so that the next time, et cetera, et cetera. We would go back and be self-critical. We don't see the people doing that today. They want to, as you pointed out to me in a previous conversation, they just want to point blame. The current leader is just like, oh, it's the fault of the previous administrator. Or, it's low-level members saying, oh, it's the problem of this body master or this SGIG. They're not really looking at the bigger picture or doing any diagnosis, as you say.
You have to look at another component here, and the component is charismatic personality. People are looking for stability. They're looking for a leadership that's going to provide them with the things that they want, which is, a stable person who isn't a kook, isn't a maniac, who will pay the bills, who will take care of things, who will act responsibly, and who won't let things get out of control. And one of my friends pointed this out, that to a certain extent, the current leaders in the OTO really deserve a kind of praise for not letting things get off the hook. You know, we may not like the current state of the OTO, and we may see a lot of problems with it, but they haven't let it deteriorate